what is going on in so much of the world, there is a real addiction to process. All these leaders we were talking about before, starting with Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos, the one thing they're universally scared to death of is process taking over their company. They are trying to scale their organization, and they can fundamentally scale either the way I was talking about before, with leaders that genuinely care and empower their people, or you give them a process and they're instructed to follow that process. And then they lose their ability to innovate. When we say principles over process, it's not that process is irrelevant. We're saying that principles matter much more.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. We talk about work as a product a lot on this show, but I hadn't spoken to anyone about best practices in product management until today. Marty Cagan was 10 years into his engineering career when he began questioning the purpose of his work. Frustrated with the products he was building, he wondered why they were being built that way. But he soon realized that asking why was the job of the product manager, not the engineer. So he became one. And not just any product manager, but one of the world's leading experts in the field. Marty is an expert and author on product management and a partner at the Silicon Valley Product Group. With decades of experience, including leadership roles at companies like eBay, Netscape Communications, and HP, he has a deep understanding of what it takes to build successful products and, most importantly, successful product teams. His latest book, Transformed: Moving to the Product Operating Model, explores how successful product organizations operate and provides insights on transforming companies into ones that consistently deliver great products. In this episode, Marty and I talk about the key elements of top product teams and best practices in product management, the capabilities and responsibilities of a good product manager, and how the whole discipline might inform how we build work. We also discuss the core principles of product culture, how following rote processes without focusing on outcomes can kill a company, non-negotiables for product managers, and other topics. All right, as always, keep supporting Work for Humans by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Marty Cagan. Marty Cagan, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thanks for inviting me, Dart.
So this is a show that was founded on the premise that work is a product. And I use that word advisedly. I'm not sure it's exactly a product, but that it fits in the same position as a product that company sells to employees. And so a huge omission on the show has been that I haven't really talked to somebody who has mastery over product management. With one exception, I had Alex Komorowski on the show, who was the product manager for Chrome and Google Maps and a bunch of other things. And we talked about platforms and how to manage platforms, but we didn't really get into product management. And so when I find a gap like that, what I do is I go on to Gemini or ChatGPT and I say, who are the world's leading experts on product management? You are first on the list of those people. The path I'm going to follow today, normally when I research something like this, I start reading the books and I start taking notes on what I want to talk about and ask. And I read Inspired, your first book, and then I read Empowered, your second book, and I was taking this long list of notes of things I wanted to ask. And then I got to Transformed, your latest book. And it was the answers to all the questions that I had compiled through the first two books. And so I'm going to anchor a lot on Transformed. And I'm going to recommend to my audience that if you're new to product management and you're thinking about it, it has a lot of the components of the first two books, and it tells you how to transform. It's a great book. How do you explain what a product team is to people who have never heard of it?
I kind of have two very different explanations depending on if they're in the product community versus if they're not. Because a lot of problems are even in the community, there's a lot of debate on this topic. But to people who are just new to the whole landscape, a product team is a cross-functional set of professionals that are staffed in order to solve hard problems in ways our customers love but work for the company, work for the business. In other words, you're solving for both the customer and you're solving for the business. That's what a product team does. That's what they're supposed to do.
And everything that you write about starts from customer problems, and it builds back all of the capabilities and all of the right behaviors and all of the right culture to actually deliver against those solutions. And I think that's an incredibly fundamental idea in all of your work. How did you determine what the best practices were in product management and in product teams?
I honestly luck. I started very early. I've been doing tech products for more than 40 years. We were chatting earlier. We're both graduates of UC Santa Cruz. At the time, I was one of the early first wave really of computer science. And I had my choice of where to go work. Early places like Apple, HP Labs. One of my professors at Santa Cruz recommended HP. They said their culture was legendary and that I would love it. And I did love it. I was there for 10 years. I was as an engineer, though, first. But the point is, I grew up in these really strong, innovative product culture companies. And I thought that was what everybody did, honestly. I was so naive. I remember when I went off to do a startup and I got more exposed to the broader industry and I realized, wow, I was really lucky. I was at Netscape Communications, which was really the original internet company. I was right there at the right time, just dumb luck more than anything else. And so I had seen these teams that were so good. And then I started getting exposed to teams that were not good and so different. It struck me at how dramatically different the best companies were from the rest. And because I had worked at these companies that were early in the product world, a lot of the leaders went on to other companies, places like Google and Amazon and Netflix. And I was called by them and say, hey, can you share some of those principles that we had learned? So over time, and to be clear, I'm talking about over about 30 years of that time, you start to see there's a set of principles that are used in the best companies consistently that, for whatever reason, seem to be absent in the rest of the companies. So I started Silicon Valley Product Group really just to share what I had experienced, and also not just working there, but with all the companies I had been talking to, with people who wanted to understand how that works. So that was really the origin story of Silicon Valley Product Group. We're only 5 people. We're very small. And all of us are longtime heads of product at good product companies. And so we just share what we've learned. Nothing in any of the books you mentioned, Inspired, Transform, Empowered, nothing was invented by us. All we're doing is sharing what we see consistently used at the top product companies. And we measure top product companies by both companies that are consistently innovative, not just one time like in an early startup, but consistently innovative, and companies that have been recognized and rewarded, usually in the stock market. We don't think that's a coincidence.
How do you recognize a company, this is a big question, that is working in a real product team way versus the alternative, which you've called a feature factory? I think the first things that's important to be able to do is to discern the difference between when things are going well and when things are not.
Honestly, it's remarkably easy once you've seen the difference. Once you've seen the difference, you can't unsee the difference. It's like if you were on some space mission and somebody dropped you on a planet, pretty soon you'd realize if the atmosphere was breathable and things like that. That's what it's like when you go into a company. So, for example, the 2 main extremes, I started out by saying in a good product team, you're given problems to solve, and the team is empowered to go figure out the best solution to that problem that solves for the customer and solves for the business. But in most companies, it's not like that at all. In most companies, usually the senior leaders, but it could be potential customers dangling a big check, could be anything. But what happens is very top down, this is what we want you to build. And so the teams are just there to implement features and projects. Those are called feature teams. And that's the more common model out there. It's just that that's not. And it's frustrating to me after so many years that that could be so prevalent when the results are so strikingly different. There's been data for years that shows when you work that way, of a bunch of ideas that you just go build, about 15% of them actually pan out. And then people scratch their heads. Why is it that most technology products fail? It's obvious, really, why they fail if you've seen both sides.
One of the key ideas there is that a true product team, like you said, is really focused on customer problems. They are measured by the outcomes for customers as opposed to how many things on the burn down list they were able to check off.
Yeah, well, that's the difference really between output, shipping features, knocking down the burn down list, or outcomes, really solving problems for customers. The customer focus is super important, but the truth is, if you go into feature companies, they'll tell you the same thing.
Hmm.
So it's not a differentiator. In other words, what matters isn't, do we care about customers? If you don't care about customers, good luck. I mean, I think you got bigger problems. The real issue is, because you give them the benefit of the doubt, these CEOs of companies that are not good at technology, they still typically care about their customers. They just don't know how to deliver those solutions. That's the part that they don't get. They understand the customer's problems, but that's the easy part. The hard part is coming up with a solution that is dramatically better than what else is out there. And that's innovation. That's technology. That's where we need this cross-functional set of skills, a product manager, a product designer, engineers, in order to solve those hard problems in ways that do satisfy the customer, but also satisfy the business.
Now, the teams that you have described that are most able to deliver against this have a bunch of characteristics. You just named one of them. There's this core set of roles. There's a product manager, there's a product designer, and there's engineers. And you said 2 to 12 engineers. That's like the atomic structure of a product team.
Amazon made famous the idea of a 2-pizza team. That's what they're describing.
But the product manager that you describe is epic, heroic in their capabilities. What are the key capabilities of a product manager and the responsibility of a product manager?
I wouldn't personally characterize them as heroic or epic. I can't in good conscience call the job heroic that took me 3 months to learn.
Okay. Yeah, interesting.
I've coached, I don't know how many hundreds of people myself. Usually it's 3 months or less to come up to speed. So I do think you have to want to learn. You've got to have somebody who can show you the ropes, but it's honestly not all that hard.
I want to explore that because let me talk about some of the things that you've said they need to know. They intimately need to know the customer problems. They intimately need to know the structure of the business that needs to function to support that. They need to have a sense for product strategy and where they want to end up, product vision. And they need to know enough engineering to be competent in communicating with engineering. And so, although it might be possible to learn, these are the things I need to know, in a particular space, it seems like those would take some time.
Well, the first thing, we don't say product managers need to know vision and strategy. That's the job of the product leaders. Because vision and strategy, the point is to identify the most important problems to solve. That is the job of leadership. Can you imagine having 50 product teams with 50 product managers and them all 50 going out and figuring out what the strategy is going to be? It would be chaos. In fact, let me just tell you my situation because it's pretty classic. And it was also harder, I think, than most. I just mentioned earlier, I was an engineer for 10 years. And like a lot of engineers, I eventually got frustrated with what we were building. And so I remember asking my manager, why are we building this? I mean, we had built this product. Ironically, it was an AI product about 40 years too early, but we built an AI product and it wasn't successful. We even decide, how does the company decide to do a product like this? Because it seems to me like that wasn't a great idea. It was not ready for prime time. There was no market there. It was there was all these reasons. And so he said, well, that's what product managers do. And I said, well, I want to learn that. So he said, well, I'm an engineering VP. I can't teach you that, but I will introduce you to somebody. And this is what was great about that culture. So I was introduced to a guy who agreed to coach me. We did it remotely. He was in Colorado. I was in Palo Alto. And the first thing he did was assess me. And he didn't even know about the products I was building. He was doing instruments, but I was doing tools for developers, for other engineers. First of all, he was asking me how many customers I visited. And no, I was like, well, I'm an engineer. I hadn't really done that. But I said I didn't think I needed to because I was a developer and we were building products for developers. Seemed logical to me. He said that is never true. In fact, he made a statement there that stuck with me all these years, which is you're not allowed to make a single decision for your product team until after you visit 30 customers. I want them to be 15 in the US and 15 in Europe. That was a 3-week business trip. It was my first real business trip. And it was 3 weeks, one trip, US, Europe. It changed my world, completely changed my world. And that was just the first dimension. I learned right away that our customers at HP were not the same as us inside the bubble of Silicon Valley. Very big differences. I remember going to Walmart's headquarters, going to FedEx. I remember going to Deutsche Telekom and going, oh my gosh, I'm literally in a different world, completely different world. The next thing in the assessment he realized is, how much do I know about go-to-market? Go-to-market is super important. It's about how does your product get into the hands of your customers? And I didn't even know what that meant. And HP had a very strong go-to-market channel of a direct sales and a channel sales organization. And he knew that quickly. He knew in about 2 minutes that I didn't even know what the jobs were. I didn't even know there were all these people on sales calls and I didn't know what their roles were. So anyway, he said, all right, I'm going to arrange on that same customer trip. You're going to meet the sales teams in US and Europe, and you're going to learn what their job really is and what's hard about their job. Completely new. The third big area he quizzed me on was the analytics, the financials on my product. He wanted to know, I had just been assigned this product. He wanted to know how much I understood about this product. How much did it cost, for example, to sell the product? How much did it cost for us to run the product? What was the contribution? All these. And honestly, I didn't know a single metric. I remember I got one question partly right. He asked was, do you know what LTV is? And I had picked up that stood for lifetime value. And I remember him being surprised that I knew that. He said, great. Well, how is that calculated for your product? And I was like, no clue. So he said, all right, I'm going to do 2 things on this because you're way, way behind on this. And I'll admit, I studied computer science. I didn't have a single finance course. I regret that. I didn't even know I should have, but I do regret that. He sent me a book on basic finance. And he also arranged for a friend of his in the finance organization of my division, the research lab. And that person tutored me lunchtimes for several months in order for me to learn. He was going through and saying, all right, these are the KPIs on your product. Not only did I not know what they were, I didn't even know when they were good or bad. And I remember, I'm still embarrassed to say this, but remember I had been a developer on the team. I didn't even know, I wasn't even aware that our product was losing money for the company. And I remember immediately after he pointed that out, I going to the rest of my team, did you know this? None of us knew. Bunch of sheltered engineers, none of us knew that we were actually losing money. But I'm like, okay, we're going to turn this around. But it starts with understanding that, the basics. Those were the 3 big areas I really needed to learn. Learn how the company dynamics worked, learn the go-to-market, and learn the customers.
How did that change the direction of the work that you were doing?
Oh, it changed everything. First of all, it changed who we were trying to solve our problems for, right there. It also changed the nature of the solutions we built. We had in mind this different approach that today it might have been a good idea. It would have been called product-led growth. Back then, it would have disintermediated the sales channel. So that would have been shut down in a heartbeat. Big companies do executive reviews every quarter. My first one was coming up, and he told me, the real purpose of this is not to review your product. They're reviewing you. If they don't think you know what you're doing, they know that it's throwing good money after bad. So they're really testing me. And thank goodness I had this guy coaching me, because he prepared me for that. I knew what they were going to care about. I knew all the analytics. I knew the customer issues. I knew the challenges that we had to face and the constraints. And I was able to answer those questions. And I remember thinking during that session that if he hadn't have taught me that stuff, it would have been the world's shortest career as a product manager. But the truth is, to your original point, if you have a manager that knows the job and cares about you, it only takes a few months to come up to speed on these things.
I love that story. But that was also in the context of an organization that knew it wanted that from you. And your manager and your manager's manager, whoever you were reporting up to, it was something that everybody knew. They were looking for that kind of perspective on the product.
That's right. In fact, those principles you find consistently in these product model companies. That's what they're doing. Most people are learning it and getting those values shared by their leaders. And recently, I'm happy to see that the leaders of these companies have been more vocal. Apple University teaches their employees there are 4 pillars to leadership, and one of them is coaching your people to learn this stuff. At Microsoft, I love how they're turning around again, and they say there's 3 pillars in their leadership, and coaching is one of those pillars. Google has for years said that the number one characteristic of their top managers is being a great coach. There's a great quote from Bill Campbell, who was literally a coach to Steve Jobs and Larry and Sergey and to Jeff Bezos, which is that you cannot be a good manager without being a good coach. So this is the value system in these companies. And I would love to see that spread to every company if I could.
I want to dig a little bit farther into the composition of a product team. We've talked about the product manager. Who's the product designer? And how are they different?
There's product manager, product designer, and engineering tech lead, and some other engineers. That's a typical team. Just to round them out, the product manager is responsible for the value and the viability of what's built, and ultimately responsible for the outcome, achieving the outcome. The product designer is responsible for the usability of what's built and the overall responsible for the customer experience, every touch point with our product that our customer has. And similarly, for the engineering tech lead is responsible for the feasibility of the solution. It's got to be technically possible, and they're responsible for the delivery of that product. Those are the 4 big risks in product: value, viability, usability, feasibility. And so we need this cross-functional team in order to solve that. Very few engineers know design. Very few product managers know design. And when I say design, of course, I'm not just talking about graphic design. I'm talking about interaction design, service design, visual design, user research. These are critical parts to not every product. I mean, some products are low-level platform products that have a developer experience, but not really user experience. But for most products, many of the ones we love, whether it's an iPhone or whether it's whatever, the product design is front and center.
And these are distinct skills. And it's hard to find them in the same person. And there's enough work that even if you could find them in the same person, you probably wouldn't.
Yeah, the technologies, it's gotten way better. When I first learned product, it really was a set of designers. Today, most of the time, there is one product designer that knows especially the service and interaction design, and then they use tools like design systems to do the other flavors of design. Because if you think about it, for example, the visual design is not per product team, or it usually applies to all the products we build. So you don't really need unique stuff for that. What's different is the service and interaction design. And so that's what our product designers focus on. I'm making some generalizations here. There are some different kinds of products, and hardware products have another dimension, which is industrial design. But for the most part, with technology, it is one designer most of the time.
You've talked about putting together teams of missionaries, not mercenaries. What does that mean?
I think it was from you, but I recently learned about that book, The Song of
The Song of Significance.
Significance by Seth Godin. It's a short book. I just inhaled it, absolutely loved it. I would say the phrase we use in the tech world to describe what he's describing is missionaries over mercenaries. We need a team of missionaries. So what he describes in that, people who really feel like what they're working on is meaningful and they feel like they have agency. I had never read the book, but if you've read it, most of that is in Empowered. It's just Empowered is talking about product teams, and Seth, of course, is talking about anybody, really.
It's very funny because reading your books, I was reminded of his books. And not because of content either, but actually because of structure. And this is not going to make any sense to anybody who reads these two books except me. But really, I found a lot in common. So that's fascinating that you pointed that out.
Yeah, I love the book. I don't understand why more people haven't discovered that book. I thought I followed his books. I've always liked his books, but I didn't even know that one existed.
It's on a very different topic than a lot of his books. It is very much about the experience of work, for instance. So I want to hop to someplace fairly late in the book, Transformed. And it's partially because I think it's one of the most explanatory things. And then we can talk about some of the case studies that you went out and found. Because what Transformed is about, just for everybody listening, it's, okay, I'm in an organization, or I am responsible for an organization that is a feature factory. It's not functioning as a high-performing set of product teams. How do I change? And so the book Transformed has a whole lot of examples of companies, not in Silicon Valley, which is super important because it's not unique to Silicon Valley, who actually made that transformation. And so we'll talk about some of those. But I want to hop way back to a very late chapter, which is culture. And it's interesting to me that it is so late in the book, because to me it seems so foundational. So maybe you'll tell me this is the wrong place to start. But I want to talk about product culture. Each chapter has a set of principles. The first principle is principles over process. What does that mean?
You might regret asking that question because I tend to get on a rant about this one. What is going on in so much of the world, and this is really a big problem. I mean, it's a problem in the US too, but it's a really big problem in places like Europe. There is a real addiction to process. And the idea is the answer to every question is a process. And I find it especially interesting and noteworthy that the one thing that all these leaders we were talking about before, starting with Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos, the one thing they're universally scared to death of is process taking over their company.
What do they mean? I have a big background in process, I got to tell you ahead of time. But I've always limited it to a very specific thing, which is using scientific method to understand the root cause of problems so that you can find them and solve them. I don't mean rote ways of doing things and telling people to do things in rote ways. So process is, our payroll's inaccurate. Let's go find out why. And we have to go way back into the incredible complexity of all the systems that are upstream of payroll and find it and fix it. And that's different because you recommended listening to the Lost interview with Steve Jobs. And I listened to that. And it sounds like what he's saying is, don't get how you do the work confused with what the work is for. Just throw out how you do the work and focus on what the work is for.
Yeah. In fact, he talked about in that interview the disease of process people. And you and I remember this because of our age, but do you remember when IBM used to be great? And he talked about in that video how IBM was killed by process people. And honestly, it's very hard to disagree with him. Nobody is saying, including him, by the way, he makes this clear, that process is evil. You use a process to make dinner at night. Process is everywhere. The real point is, are you letting process take over? I honestly hate to quote Elon Musk anymore because he's insane. But he did say, and I think he was right, the problem with big companies is that process is used as a substitute for thinking. And this is exactly what you were pointing out. That's not what you mean by it, but that's what most companies do with process because they are trying to scale their organization, and they can fundamentally scale either the way I was talking about before, with leaders that genuinely care and empower their people and their people have agency, or you give them a process and they're instructed to follow that process. And way too many companies think the answer is in process, and then they lose their ability to innovate. They lose those missionaries that we were talking about before.
And the missionaries may lose their autonomy, which is so important to them functioning, which is this: if you give them a bunch of rules and regulations and steps that they have to go through, that's like putting people in straitjackets.
Exactly right. In Seth's work, he was talking about that as the sense of agency. You lose that. No, we don't want that at all. So the point is, when we say principles over process, it's not that process is irrelevant. We're saying that principles matter much more. In fact, the book is all about the first principles that you find. I mean, just think about it. You couldn't imagine two more different companies really than Apple and Amazon. They're so different in so many ways, but yet I've worked in both. They are so true to those principles. So the principles that, even though they're building very different kinds of products in very different org structures, all that's different, but they're both two of the most consistently innovative companies in history, and they follow those principles. So what matters, I try to tell this to people all the time, what matters are those principles.
It's interesting, when Cisco Systems, which I worked for at the time, acquired Meraki, I spoke to their L&D team, and the way that their L&D team worked, which is that traditional L&D comes in and tells you how to. And Meraki didn't want any of that. They were a small startup. They said, don't give us how-tos. Bring in the people who originated the first principles behind the how-tos. You give us the principles, we'll derive the how-to. And I really admired that as an approach to learning in an organization, which is essentially first principles learning.
In fact, it's just a symptom of the process taking over. I see in a lot of these big companies, they have these learning and development teams, and they're like, yeah, we're going to teach our people. Those people working in those groups, they've almost never done it themselves. All they're doing is teaching you a process. It's a symptom of not a very good situation.
Which is what's so powerful, by the way, about how Transformed is written. It is all principles. There are other books you can read for how-to, but this is a book that just lays out principles. I want to go to the next principle under culture: trust over control.
Yeah, that's kind of at the heart of a transformation because, in fact, Netflix, which is another pretty amazing company, Netflix has a mantra, which you may have heard. It's lead with context, not control. And the point is, the feature team model, that's also known as the command and control model. Top down, the leaders make the decisions. They pass down progressive level of detail until it eventually makes it to a feature team who's told to build these features. Okay, that's one way to work. Better way to work is to lead with context. Context is short for strategic context. Because if you want teams to make decisions, and the premise of an empowered team is they're closest to the technology, they're closest to the customer, they're the ones that should make the decision. But for that to be true, you need to give them the context. You need to share with them the product vision. You need to share with them the product strategy. You need to share with them what we call the team topology, which is the bigger picture, so that each team could make good decisions for their customers.
The truth is, most of the military doesn't even believe in simple command and control anymore.
Special forces have always been beautiful examples of empowered teams.
Colonel John Boyd, who invented maneuver warfare for the military, a part of the reason why he argued that you should move decision-making out to people in the field, so to the smallest units, was to improve the tempo of decision-making. And so how does tempo play into the power of a product team?
One of the really amazing visits I've done in my career was to West Point and learning about this principle. They explained, do you really want a unit in the field that has an urgent decision to make to try to have to go get permission all the way up? I mean, it's like, no, they're probably dead if that's what you're depending on. So what you need to do is give them the context, strategic, I forget the word they used.
Schwerpunkt. I'm trying to remember. They use a lot of German words because a lot of military.
Strategic command, something like that. But anyway, it's what we mean by strategic context. You need to give them, and they need to be a cross-functional team, which they are, so they have the skills they need. And then, they understand the rules of engagement, they understand the context, and they can do their best to solve for those problems. That's the premise. This is why it's so demoralizing for so many companies where they don't have that empowerment and they feel like they can't do anything without getting permission from a whole room full of stakeholders. They feel like they're wearing one of those straitjackets we were talking about before. Now, for all that to work, for teams to be empowered to make decisions, they need to be trusted. And that's why trust is at the center of this. And trust is never a blank check. It's something you earn. And a lot of what transformation is building that trust.
One of the hardest things to do is to do that. Next one, principle, innovation over predictability.
Yeah, this is a very big one. For example, if you talk to most companies, talk to the leaders, they're like, yeah, we need to know a year in advance what's going to happen. We're trying to run a business. I need a roadmap. I need a date. The problem is I can't trust anything the teams give me. They promise a date and then they never deliver it. And I explain to them, that's your fault. That's a fault of leadership. That is not understanding the nature of product. By the way, Steve Jobs talked about this as well. He called it the disease of thinking an idea is 90% of the work. And the rest is just execution. He was trying to explain that is not how tech-powered products are built. And it's not how you want them to be built. Now, you still need to run a company. There's another great product company is Spotify, based in Stockholm, of course. And then one of the mantras on their wall is 100% predictability equals 0% innovation. And there is this relationship. Now, obviously, predictability is pretty important. Not for everything, but for some things, it is very important. And innovation is very important. Every CEO in the world will tell you they care about both. That's not the question. The question is what's more important. And what most companies have done is optimize their organization around predictability. And we know how to do predictability. I learned this, honestly, 40 years ago. It's not hard to be predictable. What's hard is to be predictable for an outcome. Everybody, when they talk predictability at this point, okay, all bets are off with outcome. All I can promise you is output. I will ship something on this date. If the customers don't like it, don't bother me. You're the one who told me you needed this way of solving it. You're the one who told me the date. You can't also throw in that it actually has to make the customer happy. That's a much bigger hurdle. So this is a tension that every organization has, and we have to get this out on the table and talk about it. That's why it's such an important principle. And it's fundamentally different. Like when you go to Amazon, experimentation is so at the center of their company, their culture, everything. It's the opposite of a focus on predictability. It's like, no, we know to innovate, you have to experiment. And like Bezos likes to say, if you know the outcome in advance, it's not an experiment. So that's a very different priority. But that's not a coincidence that they are so consistently innovative.
I'm going to skip one and I'm going to go back to it because I think you just started getting into one of the later principles of culture, which is learning over failure.
People talk about how you have to be okay with failure. For the most part, that's kind of nonsense. Failure is not a good thing, but there are two kinds of failure. The failure in an experiment, which we don't even call failure. When you run an experiment, you say, oh, it was a failure. You say, what did you learn, right? What did you learn? If it doesn't work, you learn it doesn't work in an experiment. That's not a failure. That's a success. You just saved probably months or years of work that would have taken in order to get that in front of customers. So we run an experiment, low cost, low cheap. We call that whole cycle of doing experiments early, fast, cheap product discovery. So that's not failure, really. On the other hand, if you say, oh, we don't need to do an experiment, we're confident this is going to work. I've talked to customers myself. I understand. We just need to build this. And you spend the next 3 months, 6 months, a year building that, and then you put it into the market and it fails. That's not a good failure. That's a very bad failure. That's what we try very hard to avoid, because that just wasted a ton of time and money. And by the way, in tech, it's rarely the real cost is the money, it's the opportunity costs.
It's one of the things that you wrote that really spoke to me was the idea that the whole purpose of the way that a product team works is to front load risk. It's to get as much risk into the early, cheap phases of development and get as little risk as possible into the later phases. There's still going to be risk. And in fact, that's the real problem with, here's an idea, go deliver on it. The real problem is that's a huge bet with no discovery between the idea and the actual launch of the thing. And so a lot of what you write about is how to bring that risk forward in the project. I said project, but now your next principle is move from projects to products. So let's talk about that principle.
Another one of those common misconceptions is that some executive has this idea, we need an app for our customers to do this. And they think of it as a project. They think of it, well, it'll be something like 3 to 6 months, and then we can move on and do other things. That's the mindset. Funding is done by projects. Staffing is done by projects. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works in tech-powered products. In fact, most good product companies, when they decide to go after an area, so maybe they've done some experimentation, but they decide to go after an area, it's like a 7-year decision. Now, they don't mean that they're going to wait 7 years before they get results. They usually expect results in months. But they know that a product is not a project. They know that the team is going to have to continue to learn, to test, to iterate. And probably it's too obvious of an example today, but an iPhone, how many years have they been improving that thing? And 17 years, something like that now, just keeps going. That is a great example where you have to look holistically at the product. And there's a lot of downsides to thinking and treating it like a project. One is that it's all output. A project is output. And a typical product requires a typical product, right? Which is short for time to money, as opposed to time to market. Time to market is a time thing, right? It's output. Time to money is an outcome. Typical time to money takes 3, 5, sometimes more iterations before it makes the money you need it to make, or it solves the problem for the customer well enough to achieve your outcome. So in a product model, we embrace that. Imagine a project model where, okay, finally makes it on the roadmap, you staff a project, they do it, 6 months later, they release it. Invariably, the first thing, it's not going to do very well at all. So everybody whines, 6 months later, it gets on the roadmap again for version 2. But of course, most of those people, even if they did work on it, they don't remember anymore. And they certainly felt no ownership over it the first time. They probably feel no more on it the second time. So it's what happens when you treat it as a project, as opposed to when it's a product. And that product team, which may be, and I think often should be, smaller, but it's durable. It lasts. If you're going to invest in that area, they are doing releases not every 6 months. They're probably doing releases several times a week. And they are constantly looking at the data. They're constantly talking to their customers, and they're constantly getting those outcomes better and better. It's a very different philosophy. That principle is one of the most important principles.
One of my greatest challenges in the past with the execution of product management has been actually the word product. And I'll tell you why. Product tends to mean the technology. And it's very easy to be anchored on the technology without looking at the surrounding ecosystem that extends beyond the technology. And I'll give you a very concrete example of that. I can give you a couple of examples from the HR world, which is, let's say I'm building a recruitment product. So I'm building an applicant tracking system. The user of that product is recruiters, but the customer of the recruitment activity taken whole is not recruiters, but they may not be users. And so the real customer of that is managers and candidates. And so by anchoring too heavily on product, it can shoulder aside the broader ecosystem.
We all have to pick our battles. That is not one I'd want to fix. But the point you're bringing up of this is totally normal. The user is not always the buyer. The user is not always, this is product 101, the foundation. Absolutely true. You can call it anything. I don't think that issue goes away. It's whatever you're building, you have to solve for all interested parties. Realize, even to pick something like, I actually have a lot of companies I've advised do job marketplaces, which usually often include things like ATSs, and they're in an ecosystem there. And besides HR managers, besides hiring managers, besides candidates, they also often have compliance managers and other kinds of legal and all these different approvers. There's a whole ecosystem there in order to get something successful, especially if you're trying to do it for a large enterprise. That's the game. That's the game. Product is ambiguous. There's no question about that. The title product manager, I've never liked it. Personally, never liked it. But again, you have to pick your battles.
Yeah, making up new words, like you said in one of your talks, is hazardous. There's a couple of dimensions I want to explore further. And one of them is, what's the proportion of technology in something that I can take out before it becomes not a product problem anymore? I'll give you a couple of examples of this. One is with Hertz, for instance. When I rent a car, it's very technologically enabled. Every single point in this is technology enabled, except for that point where I'm at the counter talking to a person. And right there is actually the main failure point, which is that that person seems to not be equipped to deliver. In a couple of different ways, they don't seem to be able to hire enough people to actually staff the actual booths. But this is a case where it's mostly technology. There's a person in there right at the desk, right when you're checking out the car. You should probably care about that. That makes sense. But as I move along services, here's a different service. My nephew runs a sports massage company, and it has scheduling, just like a car company. It is technology enabled, but ultimately where the rubber hits the road is with the therapist, and the therapist actually touching and helping the person physically. Now, you've anchored a lot of your work on things that have a big piece of technology at the center. Isn't it, I would argue that it is, still applicable to think about something without a ton of technology as requiring a product team approach?
It's a big question. First of all, it is very normal that products have both online and offline experiences. You can start with, you buy a book on Amazon, there's all kinds of offline things involved there. Like, what do you do if you want to return it, and what's going on at the warehouses? And just like at Hertz, there's all these people behind the scenes washing the car, delivering the car, taking the car from you and giving you a receipt. All kinds of people are involved. Think of an Uber ride. An Uber is a classic example of an online-offline experience. That's normal, just totally normal. The only question is, I would argue Hertz is terrible at applying technology. Terrible. One of the worst in the industry. On the other hand, some of their competitors are much better. They're doing the same basic jobs, but one, I would argue, Hertz treats technology as a cost center. They're famous for outsourcing their technology. It's crazy. as opposed to the way a good product company would think of it, which is an enabler. The technology is an enabler for an amazing customer experience.
And actually, that's like a question of where do you draw the circle around the product team and what they're responsible for. And it seems to me at Hertz, they should be responsible for the technology. It would be a lot better if they had real control over that. It was internal. But they also are responsible for the person behind the desk and how they're working.
Well, Uber, they have teams that are worried about the drivers. And they have teams that are worried about the riders. And by the way, they're worried about riders before you get in the car. They're worried about drivers before they pick up their passenger. This is all because they have this holistic view of the customer. So I wouldn't define product as all about the technology. The technology is an essential ingredient in a tech-powered product, but there are really three big ingredients. In fact, I was taught way back in the day that, and this was more of a metaphor, but that product is literally the product in a multiplication sense of solving for the customer experience, solving for the business, and solving for the technology. And that you have to solve for all three of those in order to have a product.
Very related to that, you argue that there are three things that are sacred to product managers. They have to do with unencumbered access. What are those three things?
The first one is really what we've been talking a lot about, which is if you don't have access to the users and customers, you're doomed. So the first one is unencumbered access to users and customers, which is, to me, the most obvious statement you could possibly utter. But in so many companies, that is not the case.
I have to tell a story on that because I'm proud of myself for this particular thing. My job was to be an intermediary between the customer and my team and the product manager. And so my job was to gather information from the customer, compress it, and give it in a usable way to the product manager. And I said we should eliminate my own team. And we did. I said, this should be disintermediated entirely because no secondhand information that I can pass on to anybody has ever been fully understood and adopted. You have to give direct access. And so I eliminated my own team to give product managers that access.
This is a good team would insist on that anyway. They wouldn't ignore you because as the manager of that team, you do represent an important stake in the business. And so you understand certain constraints. Maybe they're legal constraints or compliance constraints or something like that. And so they do need to use you, but they need to go directly to the teams.
Yes. One thing we could have done is we could have been, we're going to get you direct access. That could have been our job. And to some extent, we started doing that. So you have two other kinds of access.
Yes. So direct access to the users is number one. Direct access to the data is number two. So in other words, without data, we're flying blind. And again, it's so crazy about it on so many old companies. The executives have access to data, but the product teams that are supposed to fix the products and the experiences often don't. And that means understanding how our users are interacting with our product, understanding how buyers are actually buying our product, sales analytics. And it means having access to the data that shows how this is all changing over time. Without that, you're in big trouble. So that's the second. And the third one is actually relates to the first point you brought up, which is direct access to the different stakeholders. So for example, if you're building an applicant tracking system, you really need access to recruiters. Even though ultimately you're trying to make a hiring manager happy and you're trying to make candidates happy, the recruiters are critical.
Right. And the stakeholders is a long list. It can be an enormous list, depending upon what product you're working on. It can include finance and legal and a whole bunch of different stakeholders that need to be involved.
This is kind of like a meta principle, but what's really going on? Why is this so important? Why is it so important that we empower these teams to have this access? It's because most companies think the customers or the executives can tell you what to build. The reason that doesn't yield innovative solutions that solve the problem so often sometimes it does, but it's pretty rare, is because all of those people, none of them know what's just now possible. None of them are experts in the enabling technology. Great products come from bringing together the people that know the enabling technology, the engineers, the designers, the product manager, with the actual people suffering the consequences, the users, the customers. That's where great product comes from. So all of these well-meaning intermediaries saying, this is my requirement, are not helping.
Yeah, and one of the things you've mentioned about making domain experts product managers is that they often come with a very large set of things that they feel are impossible. That can't be done. We've tried it.
Or they come with a very large amount of dogma where they have always thought you couldn't do something, but actually that's not what the law says.
If you do, like I do, believe that the experience of work is a product. By the way, I think you've done more in your work to improve the experience of work as a product than almost anybody I know, which is you're saying this is how a team should function to be successful. And it needs to be given these freedoms and it needs to be given these certain things. Well, I think you're doing something that is very much in line with this, even though that's not your objective. So if work is a product, I'm not exactly sure who the product manager is. I would like to give a lot of freedom and choice to teams to design their own experience of work. I'd like to put that into the field. And so I imagine something above that, which I call work experience design, which is actually equipping teams with tools and principles to do that design and to build themselves better.
Well, we should talk about both of those things, actually, because you have mentioned several times that you're trying to think about work as a product. I don't understand by that statement what problem you're trying to solve. And I will point out one thing. Product is already very ambiguous. At a company like Amazon, early days, they had this confusion between the experience, which is Amazon.com, and the products they sell on Amazon, like a book.
Yeah, right.
They said, this is crazy. We're going nuts. So they made a rule. Anytime you talk about something you sell, they call it merchandise.
Got it.
Everything else, holistically, is the product. So you're layering on another set of semantics around the concept of product, and it's trying to apply to work, but I haven't understood the goal of that. What is your purpose?
There's two principles here. But the first one is when you go down this path that work as a product, employees or customers, all companies are multi-sided platforms serving two customers, one of whom is the employee and people who work for the company. And so in the same way that if you're a platform and you're trying to attract developers to work on your platform, companies are very much like that, which is that they're creating an environment that attracts people who want to work there. And so I would ask you, this is the way I go about finding out what the problem we're trying to solve is I'm going to ask you this question, which is what I ask at the end of every show, but I'm going to ask it earlier, which is, what job do you hire your job to do for you? So when you go to work, your clients hire you to do something. What do you hire your work to do for you?
I will admit I don't frame it that way. At least you haven't said anything that would want me to frame it that way. Because so far, all it just seems is very confusing.
Okay.
I just haven't seen the upside yet. I do appreciate that everybody is looking for something different out of their work. And I resonated very strongly with the book we were talking about before, The Song of Significance, because I do believe not everybody, but most people want meaning out of their work. And I feel like it's been a huge privilege to always be able to work on something I believed was meaningful. And none of it was curing cancer or anything, but I think they were all, in my mind at least, helping the world get a little bit better. And so I find that very, very rewarding. I'm also very attracted to the people I work with. I want that interaction. I have found ever since the very first time I was on a team, a real team, and I saw what it means to have the sum be greater than the parts, I've been hooked. Everybody I know who's had the experience of working on a good product team, they never want to go away from that. They want to constantly repeat that. I summarize this a lot of times, like you heard me say before, we want to be teams of missionaries, not mercenaries. You want people that really believe. That's one of the reasons I just wrote recently an article about how the product model applies in government and nonprofits. I mean, you don't have to be money making for the product model. And one of the reasons I like those contexts is because almost everybody that works there is very driven by the mission. They're there for the purpose, the meaning. So I definitely resonate with that. Trying to put that in a box, which is called product, just feels a little bit of mental contortionism there.
Which it may be. And in fact, the word product is nice because it sounds concrete. The word service is nice, but it puts the person who's consuming the service into a very passive position. The word experience is nice, and we've had Joe Pine on the show a couple of times talking about the experience economy. That starts to look good, and the word transformation looks good. But product may be too small a box, but let me reflect back on what you said, which is that you hire your job to work with people, in part to amplify yourself, and to give you the ability through that amplification to make the world a better place. And you might also hire your job, because you're so good at it, for a stage and an audience, which is you like to speak, you like to tell people, you like to give people information about how the world could be better. Not all companies are able to respond to that unique need. And for a big company, if they want everybody to be a missionary, if you think that having missionaries is a powerful thing, then actually what you're selling and what you design and sell, let's forget the word product, that actually meets your definition of meaning. Because one of the things about the word meaning that is not very great is that everybody's meaning is different. And so if I'm designing work for you, saying meaning is not enough. I have to dig down deeper and find out what meaning really is for you. And that starts to break up into a lot of different things, which have not been delivered well. One of the biggest customer problems of workers in the world is that they have crappy work that has no meaning, and it does not meet the needs, their specific needs of that product, which is more than those things that you said. Some people just want to get out of the house. Some people want to leave a legacy. Some people want to solve puzzles that they've never had before. And there's a whole range of things. And work has never been conscious of that. And how we deliver work has never been conscious. And so I use the word product because I think the tools of product management can be brought to bear on that, which is, how do I get that into your hands in such a way that you have the experience of work that you're describing on great product teams?
I would love to introduce you to an amazing person named Phil Terry. I don't know if you know that name. He's actually the author of Never Search Alone, which is, to my knowledge, the first really good book for somebody looking for a job. And in that book, he describes the concept. You know how in the product world, we have this very fundamental, maybe the most important concept, which is called product market fit. It's like, do you have the right product for this market? He introduces the concept of candidate market fit. And his book fleshes this out. But the idea of candidate market fit is trying to speak to what you're talking about. There's the needs of the candidate. There are the needs of the company too. And what you're looking for, of course, is a match. And he's all about that. He's also about job search councils, where you basically get a peer network of people helping you to develop your candidate market fit and to be a better fit for the role you want.
That's very much similar to language I have, which is that your skills are the currency with which you can buy the kinds of work experiences you want. I would love to be introduced to him, and I'd love to see if I can get him on the show. I think it would be fantastic.
I bet he will. I didn't answer your original question about product ops. I can, but...
Well, I mean, so let's say managers and their teams are co-creating the experience of work. Somebody needs to exist to equip them. And to the extent that that is a design activity that they are doing, they need to be equipped with design tools. And to the extent that they are, I'm going to call them a product team, although we're definitely going to be dicey, but to the extent that they are actually working on a product, which is the local experience of the team, they need to be given autonomy and they need to be given the freedom and the trust to design it for themselves. And so there's some body that is creating success, the context in which a product team can be successful. And to some extent, that's equipping them, that's training them. And I was wondering if that was product ops. It's that thing?
Well, the reality is in most companies, nobody does that well.
Nobody does that.
Nobody
Okay.
does. My view is in good companies, that is not product ops. That is the product leaders. Literally, I'm trying to remember here. I love this quote. It was a Bill Campbell quote, and the quote is around the job of a product leader is to create the environment necessary for their teams to do great work. So I put the responsibility squarely in the product leader, the chief product officer, the chief technology officer, the head of design. They squarely are responsible for that. If they delegate that, that makes me very nervous. It also tells me about their priorities. So could they delegate it in a really large organization? Sure. And if they delegate it to somebody really good, which this is the part that really drives me nuts in a lot of product ops organizations, it should be their most senior experienced people. It's usually their least senior people. It's viewed as a support role, a junior role. And that is like the worst thing you can do. You're going to institutionalize the wrong behaviors. So I would say squarely responsibility of the leader to create that environment.
Love that. I love that. I love how, in general, you put ownership very locally, that everything in the environment is owned by the people responsible for it. There's very, very strong ties of ownership. There's a book on your shelf that I didn't read, and it is loved. And the reason is it didn't come up under your name, but it's clearly in the same series.
It is written by my partner, Martina Luchenko, and it's on product marketing.
Why is it called Loved?
She chose the title because the number one thing they worry about in product marketing is getting products to be adopted, right? You want your people to, we do all this work to create a product that people love. Well, you want them to discover it. You want them to enjoy it. And so she put the emphasis on the outcome, which is they love our products.
Okay, I like that. Okay, I'm going to have to get into that book next and see if I can get her on the show. That'd be fantastic.
She'd be very good. She studied at Stanford organizational design. I think she would love these topics.
And a part of the reason, because I didn't look at the book, because I didn't know it was part of the series, I thought it might relate to Fred Reichheld's work on loving your customer.
It's not unrelated.
And no, it's not unrelated. No, it's not. It's interesting to me that Silicon Valley has come up with completely distinct ways of working. And conversation for another time is, how the heck did that happen? It's like the history of product thinking, because it really is the epicenter of this approach.
I think that's true, but I also think it's not that surprising. The biggest thing you'll notice about sort of Silicon Valley is, in general, the companies are very young. They don't have the legacy. You go to New York, you go to Chicago, London, Berlin, there's a lot of very old established companies that were well pre-internet, just very, so well established in sort of the industrial models. But Silicon Valley, it's like they're new, they didn't have a lot of legacy, and there is no question that the priority is innovation. No question.
Correct. And what you have found, and we didn't actually get to one of these case studies, but what you have found is that companies that are not Silicon Valley companies, companies that may have 150 years of history, can actually transform. And that's the topic of your book, Transformed, can transform into a product-led company or a product-managed company.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've seen it all around the world for years. And we picked a lot of our favorite examples for that book from places you would never imagine. would have great tech-powered teams.
Yeah, and so what that means is, listeners, you're going to have to read the book because we didn't actually get into any of those case studies, and they're fantastic, powerful case studies. Thank you very much for coming on the show today. Really appreciate it. Where can people learn more about your work?
Thanks for inviting me, Dart. And just svpg.com is we publish articles pretty much every week, and everything's free, and help yourselves.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.